In this lesson, we take a look at the Rayswitch shader. As you can see, the scene is the same one from when we're discussing subsurface
And
scattering.
here I have this reflective
scene,
box.
as you can see, I have this transmissive refractive glass. And let's get started with the Rayswitch shader. If I open up this shader network that's called Rayswitch, it's just an empty shader network. I've just created some standard surface shader. We discuss them in a moment, but for now, let me just search for Rayswitch. As you can see, we have two Rayswitch shader and Rayswitch RGBA. And this is like when we're discussing the layer color node, we had one layer node that was specific for shader and surface inputs, and another layer node that was layer color that was specific to color and texture inputs. And this is the same thing here. We have the Rayswitch shader that is specific to shader and surface inputs, and we have the Rayswitch RGBA for texture and color inputs. In this case, let me just drag in this Rayswitch shader. Now, Rayswitch shader allows you to use different types of shaders for different ray types. It can be for artistic reasons. For example, if you want to see another shader to appear instead of the main shader when you look at your object through a piece of glass, or if you wanted to see another shader to appear in the specular reflections instead of your main shader, or when doing image-based lighting, when you want to see one HDR image in the background and another one for your indirect diffuse, or if you want to see different HDR images with different resolutions for your different ray types, one high-res image for your refraction and camera rays, one smaller image and blurrier one for the glassy rays, and let's say another one much smaller and blurrier for your indirect diffuse rays. So in this case, let me just assign this shader network to this dragon model. Okay, let me just delete the original one here. And now let me just run the IPR. Let's connect the Rayswitch to the Arnold Beauty. As you can see, I have this kind of pre-made standard shaders already. We have these kind of white standard shaders. We have these, let me actually stop the IPR so you can see these shaders. So this is our white standard shader. We have this kind of refractive standard shader. I'm probably just going to use a slightly less saturated color. We have these, as you can see, reddish standard shaders, this pinkish standard shader, standard surface shader, sorry, and this greenish standard shader and this orangish standard shader. Now let's say for the camera rays, I want to use these white standard shader. You can actually connect our Rayswitch shader. See this white standard shader IPR. So as you can see, our camera rays. Let's connect this refractive standard shader, standard surface shader, to our shadow rays. We don't see any change, but I'm going to discuss that in a moment. Let's use this pinkish and reddish standard shaders as our diffuse reflection and as our diffuse transmissions. You can see immediately now the diffuse transmission and reflection rays see this dragon to be a pinkish reddish dragon instead of a white dragon. Now let's use this kind of greenish standard surface shader as our specular reflections. So as you can see in this reflection box, the reflection rays actually see this dragon to be a green dragon and not a white dragon that we see in our camera rays. And for our, let's see, specular transmission or transmission rays, let's use this orangish standard surface shader. And as you can see, now we see this dragon through this glass to be an orange dragon instead of this white dragon. That's because our transmission rays actually see this dragon to be an orange dragon because we have connected this standard surface shader to the specular transmission input. So as you can see, it can be very fun to work with the Rayswitch shader and create some fascinating stuff. Now let's take a look at the shadow rays. And here for the shadow rays, basically the shader evaluation that happens for the transparent shadows on the objects is being controlled by this shadow input here, right? And we only can see the shadow rays because we need to make sure our light can actually pass through the object and we have color for refractive qualities. So we actually have some colorful shadows. But at the timing, you can see the shadows is just black. And the reason is we are dealing with transparency in the shadow rays, because you can see this is the material that we have. As you can see, it has transmissive qualities. And Arnold at the timing has no idea. So let's tell Arnold simply by right-clicking on the dragon, adding a Arnold parameter tag, and disabling the opaque option. And now, as you can see, immediately we see this colorful green transparent shadows, and I can use another color, let's say like this bluish color, and you can see the change immediately. And if I decrease the transmission weight, you can see now the shadow isn't as powerful as before, but it's really up to you. And as I mentioned, we also have the Rayswitch RGBA. If you remember, when we're talking about the image-based lighting, we actually use the Rayswitch RGBA. So in case you are, for example, dealing with textures and you want to make these variations for different ray types for your textures and color inputs, you need to actually use the Rayswitch RGBA and not the Rayswitch shader itself. In that case, if you remember, we connected our one HDRI to the camera rays and one other HDRI to the shadow, diffuse, reflection, transmission, and specular reflection, transmission. And in that case, our camera rays saw one HDR image, and our different ray types saw another HDR. You can actually check that lesson if you want to see how we actually did that with the Rayswitch RGBA. So that's about Rayswitch and Rayswitch RGBA in Arnold for Cinema 4D. See you in the next lesson to talk about another topic.